Essentially, what you get from 1997 is a deliberate demolition of the Anglo-centric British state. We have contradictions in the heart of our government, the heart of our politics, which means it can't work. This is the consequence of stupid law, stupidly enforced by stupid judges. The whole thing is a disastrous, utter mess. And do you know who summarised it best? It was those rioters in the north of England. Their principal cry was, "We want our country back." They felt viscerally that it had been taken away. And do you know what? They were right.
Hello and welcome to this special episode of The Skeptic. I'm your host, Laurie Wastel, an associate editor at the Daily Skeptic, and I'm very pleased to be joined this week by Professor David Starkey, historian, author, and broadcaster. Welcome to The Skeptic, Professor Starkey.
Hello.
Okay, so to begin with, obviously there's a lot of things to talk about in politics at the moment, but to start with, I'd like to go back almost 30 years to Tony Blair's New Labour and what really happened there. Because for a lot of people, at least, the perception of Tony Blair was that he was a relatively normal politician. You know, the Iraq War wasn't very good, but he spent a bit more money on the NHS, and he was a good speaker, things like that. And I think even Margaret Thatcher once said that he was her greatest legacy because she thought he was going to more or less continue what she had been doing. But in fact, you've been saying that's quite wrong, and that that's really failing to grapple with what really happened under Tony Blair, which was nothing less, in fact, than a constitutional revolution. Now, why do you say that, and how far-reaching were those changes?
Well, let's actually begin with the point of the heir to Thatcher. This is the remark that Margaret makes in 1992. And you can see there's a degree of justified self-satisfaction. She is recognising, as indeed Tony Blair recognised, that Thatcher and Thatcher's guru, somebody about whom we will speak later, Keith Joseph, actually changed the terms of economic debate. That's the key thing, is to understand simply that what Thatcher did was to replace the entire post-war economic consensus of Keynesian economics, of the regarding of inflation as a necessary part of demand management and economic management, inflation to be kept under control by things like prices and incomes policies and all that sort of thing. She swept all that away. And instead, we had a version of, if you like, basic free market economics imposed on us by, again, it's very important, Laurie, to understand this, the deliberate demolition and repealing of the actions of the Labour government of 1945 to 51. The nationalisations were swept away, the indulgent legislation of trade unions was swept away, and so on. All of that, the sales of council houses, the sales of nationalised industries, and so on. Right. All of that Blair, as part of his third way, appears to accept. That's why people, in a sense, thought not very much was happening. It's also, again, why conservative opposition after 1997 has been so extraordinarily ineffective. Conservatives have continued arguing about free market economics, and all of our think tanks, the Centre for Policy Studies, the Institute of Economic Affairs, the whole of what the left demonizes as the Tufton Street mob, they're all pushing that free market economics, which is why they've been completely ineffective. Because what Blair did, and I think Blair is the front man. Can we get this absolutely clear? Blair is the front man. The real figure in all of this is a man called Gordon Brown. He had the intelligence, he had the determination, and perhaps above all, he had the Scottishness, because essentially what you get from 1997 is a deliberate demolition of the Anglo-centric British state. I mean, it really is as big as that. Forgive me, you're too young to remember, but we all laughed when Blair said, we are a young country. We thought it was all the nonsense of cool Britannia and dreadful pop and whatever. In fact, there was really an invention of a new country. The old Britain centred on essentially an expansion of the English constitution, Parliament, King, Lords and Commons in meeting in Parliament, wasn't completely swept away. The sovereignty of Parliament, and therefore of the British people, was never directly attacked. But what you did was to subvert it and to create really a parallel state. So what we have, in fact, and one of the reasons, this is very important to understand, one of the reasons our government has worked so badly, why New Labour correctly, the current Labour Party, Change Labour, I think it's called, talks about broken Britain, is it is broken. We have contradictions in the heart of our government, the heart of our politics, the heart of our administration, which means it can't work well. Let's now look at what they actually did. And let me divide it first into the political before we actually look at the actual dissolution of Britain by devolution. And when New Labour came in, it decided to do a series of things. The first was as we all know, to give independence to the Bank of England. So the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England determines one of the most important functions of government fiscal policy, which is the setting of interest rates. Now, everybody sort of said, oh, isn't that a terribly good thing? But it's the first step of a general pattern in which you deliberately remove power from elected representatives. You remove it from the only group of people that there can be any form of direct control over, namely MPs. Now, Laurie, I am no fool. I know that most MPs are no better than the rest of us, and a great many of them are very much worse. I'm no starry-eyed idealist. But as the last election shows, we do have the ability to get rid of them. None of us can remove the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, despite the fact that it is perfectly clear since 2008 it has been incompetent on a simply extraordinary scale. And much the wreckage of the national finances is due directly to its incompetence. But the Monetary Policy Committee was only the first of one set of very important creations. These are the quangos, the quasi-autonomous government institutions, allegedly committees of experts. And of course, there's a great problem with these committees of experts. They're experts in just one field, and they look at just one aspect of it, interest rates. Now, this is tremendously difficult because, of course, government is about dealing with all sorts of things. It's about dealing with incommensurables. It's about weighing things that are very difficult to weigh against each other. Now, interest rates are comparatively simple if you have just the target of managing inflation. But look at some of the other of these things. English nature. Now, English nature, again, is another one of these specialist quangos. It's now run, of course, by environmental fanatics. But English nature also manages land use, which is why we're in the preposterous position that bats and newts can outweigh human convenience and can outweigh human safety, because things like dredging of rivers and whatever. So you've got English nature. You've got still worse. You've got the Climate Change Committee. Climate change, because it's prioritised in the way it is probably the most important set of decisions. As we know, it's leading directly to deindustrialisation, a staggering multiplication of fuel costs. The government has nothing to do with this, or very little to do with it. There is another one of these specialist committees. So the quangocracy state is one that deliberately removes actual detailed governing. By the way, the Conservatives made it actually worse. That when they came in, the first thing they did was to turn the NHS into a gigantic quango. The Secretary of State for Health takes all the blame and has got none of the responsibility, because the NHS, I was going to say runs itself, misruns itself, as we can actually see, which is one of the reasons it's so profoundly unreformable. So there's a multiplication of quangos. The next thing you do, and all this within the first, again, the great difference between that Labour government and this one is that Labour government had a serious agenda, and it legislates this big stuff absolutely immediately. The next thing that it does, of course, is to incorporate the thing that's at such debate at the moment, the European Convention on Human Rights, into English law. Now, there's a real problem here, Laurie. Human rights sound lovely. They're cuddly. You know, we all want our rights. But and again, the left and those who are ardent, people like Starmer, who are ardent advocates of this stuff, say, oh, you know, it all began with Churchill and Eleanor Roosevelt. But the point is, that version of the convention. As long time ago, the convention has been developed by activist judges in the European Court, and it's been stood on its head. The original purpose of that human rights legislation, remember, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, in the immediate aftermath of fascism and the horrors of Nazi Germany, of fascist Italy, of Phalange Spain and all the rest of it, it was designed to protect you and me and the individual against the state. What has happened is that the European Court of Justice has turned it into something completely different. It's turned it into an instrument to protect minorities against the majority. And the problem with that, of course, is the only way you can do that is by turning the weight of the state against most people in the country. So human rights have literally been stood on their head. So that's one problem with human rights. Let me go on and list them. The other problems with human rights is if you say there's a thing called European human rights, or with the United Nations, universal human rights, what that says is that the source of law, and remember, this is law that governs most of the important relations, that governs family relations, the right to family life, that governs freedom of speech, that governs religious expression, all of these absolutely fundamental freedoms. What you're actually saying is that the balance between freedom and responsibility and state security in all of these areas isn't something to be decided by us, the British people. It's something that's somehow handed down from on high. Where does it come from? Where do universal human rights come from? When did they come into existence? The answer is they're a series of legal fictions, and they're enforced by lawyers entirely unrestrained by popular opinion. So once again, we see this deliberate removal of important decisions from anything that's susceptible to democratic control. But there's another problem. If we have universal human rights or European human rights, that means there's no difference between me and anybody else of whatever nationality. You abolish effectively the idea of nationality, which is why there is this argument that foreign criminals here have to have exactly the same rights as you and me, respectable British citizens. This, I think, is a monstrosity. But it even goes further. It actually calls the existence of the nation state into question. It effectively abolishes frontiers. And if people like Mr. Solomon, who runs the Refugee Council and is an ardent believer in this stuff, if he was honest, he would say there shouldn't be any frontiers. There should be no difference between the native and the foreigner. I remember, I was ages ago when I was still allowed on the mainstream media, I described illegal immigrants as aliens or foreigners. And needless to say, some lefty leapt up and said, how can you use such a wicked pejorative word and all the rest of it? But there is a difference between those of us who are native, those of us who are citizens, and those who are not. But human rights, universal human rights, denies that. And then there was a comparative period of settling down, and then at the end, towards the end of the New Labour years, two other things happened. The first was the abolition of the old supreme, the way in which very difficult legal cases were solved before the New Labour government was what was called the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords, because the theory is clear. In the old British Constitution, Parliament was sovereign over everything. It was sovereign over law, it was sovereign over the executive, it was itself the legislative. And in other words, there was no formal separation of powers. And what you do instead, with the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005, you introduce this catastrophic idea of a Supreme Court. Now, how could any lawyer think of such a thing? Well, it's mainly vanity. It was vanity on the one hand of somebody like Lord Bingham, who incidentally again says that the essential purpose of law is to protect the minority, this extraordinary notion. Anyway, you come up with this vain structure, which is partly the result of legal ambition, and on the other hand, low politics. Tony Blair was fed up with his legal mentor, Lord Irving, who was the Lord Chancellor, and and getting rid of the power of the Lord Chancellor was part of this. So you set up, alongside a theoretically sovereign parliament, a Supreme Court, and the two go to war, as we see it most clearly in the prorogation, the argument over the legality of Boris Johnson's prorogation of Parliament, where, although it was unspoken, what that action does, declaring the prorogation illegal, is effectively to repeal the most important clause of the Bill of Rights of 1689, which draws a clear line between judicial and parliamentary power. It's quite outrageous. And then the final thing, a final piece in this terrible jigsaw of chaos, this Babel's Tower of horror that the new Labour government introduced, was the Equality Act. Harriet Harman, the late mother of the House, great triumph. Once again, equality sounds wonderful, but the problem is twofold. It first of all legislates rights for minorities. The equality is a special equality of minorities. In other words, it legislates inequality. I mean, again, Laurie, look at the insane debate we're having over transsexuality or transgenderism. It's mad. It's about 300 people in real terms. It is completely. It is the final absurdity of the situation in which this tiniest of tails wags the biggest of dogs. But that's the Equality Act. But the other phase, in other words, Orwellian standing of words on their head. It is the Equality Act legislates violent inequality. All the things that we've seen with two-tier policing and whatever go back to the combination of the prioritization of minorities by the interpretation of the European Rights Convention on the one hand and the Equality Act on the other. But there's a final mad point which I will leave you with before we move on, which is the Equality Act, believe it or not, also legislates the long ago rejected Marxist theory of the theory of the intrinsic value of labour. And there are actually equations in the Equality Act which judges have to apply in determining what is an utterly impossible question. Is it fair to pay, for example, the terrible example in Birmingham, is it fair to pay cleaners, who are mainly women, at level X, and dustmen, who are mainly men, at level Y? Now, only the market can determine that. Instead, this preposterous example of an absurd economic theory is literally written in a set of stupid equations into the law, was applied by judges, and what did it do? It bankrupted Birmingham. And this is the consequence of stupid law, stupidly enforced by stupid judges, which is the authentic, genuine legacy of New Labour, and with, of course, our dreadful Prime Minister as the final legatee of the lot, which is a very long answer to a short question, but you did ask me an omnibus, when we've left out devolution.
And so let's get into devolution in a moment, shall we? But one of the points you raised there was about the Supreme Court, and also this phrase about the separation of powers. And both of these are, of course, Americanisms, aren't they? And I'm interested to get into the sort of the mindset of these new Labour types in the 90s. And so there's a pamphlet that was actually written about them by a fellow called David Willits, called Blair's Gurus on these thinkers. And the point that he makes at the end, I'll just quote it to you. It was...
Sorry, isn't David Willits a Conservative politician?
Yes, he is. But it was on an examination of New Labour's rhetoric at the time. And one of the points he makes at the end, I'll just quote it to you, is that the dilemma which these Blairites face is that they are seeking to make Britain something else. What they do not like about us is precisely what makes us British. And so would you say that's a fair characterisation of what's really going on behind the New Labour constitutional revolution?
I would. I mean, you can see it's got two sources, Laurie. One of them is America, but more importantly, it's the characteristic post-Second World War states in Europe. And in both of them, both in America and in Europe, there was one dominating feature, which was and this all sounds odd when we talk about America, a deep distrust of direct democracy. The whole structuring of the American Constitution, which is why the classic American will say, we are not a democracy, we are a republic. It's why you have an electoral college, which means that the president is not elected, the president of America is not elected just by a direct majority of whoever votes for whoever whom. You vote on a state-by-state basis, so the result is weighted deliberately towards the smaller states, and the original idea of the actual convention, the electoral college, was that it would actually debate the choice of president, though in fact that was forgotten. Within Europe, and particularly the West German constitution, the case is even more extreme. Enormous checks were built in deliberately against a democratic majority, because of course everybody said, well, Hitler was the result of a vote. He wasn't quite. But you see what I mean? There is this incredible fear of direct democracy. And the way this feeds in, and it's again very important we understand this, it feeds in to something else. It feeds in to this world that actually was already sort of there under Blair, but has become much, much clearer in the decades afterwards. And for this, we've got to go to another very interesting figure, David Goodhart, and his book, which identifies these two groups of people, the somewheres and the anywheres. The somewheres are those, actually a bit like me. I'm a somewhere with the value. I'm an anywhere with the values of somewhere. The somewheres are the people who are here, who are rooted, feel very, very much an attachment to the soil, to their language, to the culture. In other words, most, dare one use the word, ordinary people. The anywheres are the highly educated, the highly mobile, the multilingual, those with superior professional qualifications who can simply flit around, like Rishi Sunak. If you remember, I was on last year. I was severely criticised for saying I didn't feel he was culturally rooted. Nothing to do with whether he's a Hindu or not. It was simply that he was part of this, flitting here, flitting there, house in California, and whatever. But they're associated with increasingly two radically different sets of values. And it is this radically different value set which is legitimated and transformed effectively into law by what the Labour Party did, what New Labour did. And of course, it shows most clearly over immigration. The characteristic anywhere view of immigration is, it's a terribly good thing, because we're all really the same, aren't we? As indeed anywheres are. And does it really matter that lots of people wearing yashmaks and whatever finish up in Finsbury Park or Rochdale and it looks like Mogadishu? No, it doesn't. On the other hand, the old inhabitants of Finsbury Park, if there are any left, and the old inhabitants of Rochdale object very, very much to this. And it is now this tension between one set of values held by the elite and another set of values held by the bulk of the population. And you know what? We've actually had completely to reinvent language. And I want to share with you now something that I think is fairly original, and I don't think has been spelled out before. Why have we needed to invent this word populism? Populism, after all, is simply a vaguely Latin version of what we used to call democracy. Democracy does mean, if you actually look it up in any dictionary of political thought, democracy means the rule by the majority of citizens, or should do. But of course, what's happened with the reinvention of the Blairite state is that it no longer does mean that. As Bingham said, as so many others have effectively said, it means the protection of minorities, including, generally speaking, very antisocial minorities, like, dare we say it, gypsies and Romanis. We've seen the problems in Leeds and so on. It means the active protection of these against otherwise normal, active, responsible, decent citizens. And this produces the most profound tensions. So democracy has been, again, it's a word that's been stood on its head. And the old meaning of what is popular, what most people want, which is what democratic systems were supposed to give, has now become, in fact, a no-no word. I mean, dear me, it's a popular, can you imagine? It's a popular opinion. It's a terrible idea. Most people want it. How absolutely shocking. It reminds me, to finish, we're being terribly serious, it reminds me to finish with a little bit of a joke on this one. Back in the days when I was really famous historically, there were people in my profession, amongst historians, who actually hated the fact, I was swanning around on TV and they were sitting in their miserable little red brick universities and driving nasty Morris Minors. And I had a decent Daimler, and they got very cross with me. And so, of course, I was denounced as this terrible thing, a popular historian. I responded by saying, I suppose it's better than being an unpopular historian. And you see what I mean? It's how these words have all been stood on their head. And one of the first things that those of us on the right, and particularly your generation, will have to do is recapture language.
And that's very much a word that Starmer sort of spits out in his speeches, isn't it? Populism. But to go back to that reforming agenda for a second, and also you mentioned that perhaps the current Labour government isn't being as forceful and radical in the changes it's bringing in. But, of course, two of them that they are at least trying to continue with are, firstly, they want to abolish the remaining hereditary peers. And then also Angela Rayner very much seems to want to continue with devolution, including devolution to regional assemblies and things like this. And so to go back to how this played out the first time around, why was this so much of a problem under New Labour in the first place? And what does that mean for now?
Well, the problem was that what we've seen there, Laurie, is, as I've described it and as we've discussed, the constitutional revolution was designed basically to destroy the dominant element in the old constitution, which was the direct answerability of Parliament to the people. It was a profoundly anti-democratic enterprise. The second thing was actually to destroy the very fabric of Britain. Now, this sounds a very rash and dangerous thing to say. Let me try to explain it. And again, it accounts for both the success of things like the relative success of our immigration policy and what we are now seeing as its ultimate and profoundly dangerous failure. Why has Britain been able, unlike, say, France or most European countries, to cope with waves of immigrants from very different cultures without, until relatively recently, a violent pulling apart of the structures of the state and government? Well, the answer is that Britain, right from the beginning, is a multinational state. That's to say, there is no such thing. This is something that will sound very uncomfortable. There never has historically ever been any such thing as a British nation. British nationality, yes, as a jurisdictional status, as the fact, what is your citizenship? You're a British citizen. But there has never been, as it were, a single British nation which has had a single style of values or whatever, as there was an attempted creation of a French or a German or an Italian or indeed even an American. Let's look at how this happens. It happens because the foundation of Britain is the union in what originally was conflict and was finally by agreement of Britain, of England, two completely separate historic monarchies, the historic monarchy of England and the historic monarchy of Scotland. The two fused first in 1603 with the death of Elizabeth I, the last of the House of Tudor, and the succession of her cousin, of James of Scotland, who descends from Mary, Queen of Scots, and descends from Henry VIII's eldest sister, Margaret Tudor. So in other words, Elizabeth descends from Henry VIII himself, his line dies out, and so it goes back to the descendants of Henry's elder sister, Margaret, and you get the union of the crowns. But the union of the crowns leads to a century and a half of violent war. We need to understand this. When we talk about England and Scotland being together with separate parliaments and whatever, as we're sort of doing now, we're going back to a history of deep conflict. What happened instead in 1707 as a consequence of those years of strife, and also as the beginning of the astonishing expansion of England, and it's the expansion of England at the end of the 17th century, the Scots and the English decide that they will unite. But it's very important to understand why and how. Why do they unite? Well, Scotland had just bankrupted itself. Remember, Scotland is tiny. Then it's probably 500,000 people. England is 7 or 8. So there's again this enormous disproportion of size and economic power. But Scotland had tried, imitating England, to set up its own empire in Latin America with the Darien scheme in the Isthmus of Panama. It had failed. Scotland was bankrupt. They also had something very much in common. The lowlands of Scotland, like most of England, was passionately Protestant, and they feared the Catholic Highlanders and the risk of an alliance with Louis XIV of France and all the rest of it. So these positives and negatives bring England and Scotland together, but it's a union of two free peoples, and it's done on severe conditions. This is the really important thing. Scotland is not conquered. Scotland is not colonized. Scotland enters into a carefully refined and carefully limited agreement. Scotland, and it's really important, let's tell another joke amidst all this seriousness. Scotland protects its universities so well that when Margaret Thatcher, in other words, they're all written, the historic Scottish universities, all 5 of them, are written so completely into the Act of Union that when Margaret Thatcher wanted to abolish one of them, Aberdeen, she was told by my old friend Conrad Russell, Earl Russell, in the House of Lords, that if she wanted to abolish Aberdeen, she'd first have to repeal the Act of Union. So you can see, you embed in the Act of Union Scotland's separate identity in education. Scotland's separate identity. It's got its own church. The monarch actually changes church when they go across the border. You have its entirely separate judicial system. You've separate rights for currency issuing, although Scotland came to share the pound sterling. It's got its own royal court. It's got its own coronation regalia. It's got its own system of heraldry, which is entrenched in law with the Lord Lion in a way, common law, in a way, Scots law, in a way which heraldry is not in England. So the only thing that Scotland gives up that's separate in 1707 is its own parliament, and it had already it had already fused its monarchy with England, but it abandoned separate coronation rights. So the Anglo-Scottish state, which becomes known as the United Kingdom, incorporates these two separate kingdoms, with the political centre being English, but Scotland preserving all its own separate sense of cultural nationhood. And the same was true of the elements which had already been fused into England, Wales, and Ireland. So what you get from 1707 is this highly complex pattern of a state of 4 nations with very significantly different cultures and to some extent languages, but one that was predominant, which you can call the Anglo-British state, right? You see what I mean? The fact that you've fused the political representatives of all the others, it had been done with Wales by Henry VIII and so on, into the English-British Parliament, the Westminster Parliament. What Gordon Brown does is deliberately to break that single link of union between England and Scotland, which is the Parliament, or to half break it with setting up this clown Parliament in Scotland. Because again, and another clown Parliament, another Parliament of children in Wales. We'd already had the terrible experiment of a clown Parliament in Northern Ireland ever since the First World War, and you can see the terrible problems of sectarianism and whatever that it leads to. And remember, the alleged reason for doing this in 1997 was to stop Scottish nationalism. And in fact, of course, it provided the perfect playpen for Scottish nationalism because it gave Scottish politicians power without responsibility. You know, as Baldwin said, the prerogative of the harlot, that's to say, the prostitute throughout the ages, because you give them the power to control expenditure without having to raise it all by taxation. But what it's a deliberate attempt at doing is removing this overarching single culture, this Anglo-British political culture. And the result of that is, I think, that on the one hand, because we'd all, and can I just in ordinary terms, get home to people. You all know that we're separate nations because we've got separate football teams. The first football internationals were between England and Scotland. It's why there is no British team. But it all worked because the earlier nationalism, the Celtic nationalisms, if you like, were essentially cultural. They were about kilts and bagpipes and, awful poets who write things like Auld Lang Syne. I rather like Burns, but that's another matter. So when we had immigrants of very radically different kinds coming in a sense, we were already used to that. Because one of the things that's really striking after Union in 1707, we made no attempt at creating a single British identity. If you look at France, Germany, America, what you do is you use compulsory universal education to try to impose a single set of values. We've never done that. We have a multitude of, come on, you're the creation of Toby Young. The whole business of free schools, academy schools, is the modern example of it. We have this highly diverse educational system, and what a good thing too. But it means we've never tried to impose a single identity. Now, again, what the Blair government did under Gordon Brown was, in fact, to claim that there was such a thing as Britain. I mean, remember, again, the only thing that really bound together all of these separate peoples in formal terms was representation in the Westminster Parliament, but also loyalty and an oath of allegiance to the crown. It was the absolutely central role of the monarchy in all of this. I mean, if you look, for example, I have a plaque that was given to my father's family after his elder brother, Abraham, died of wounds that he received at Gallipoli. It's inscribed, with the British Lion and Britannia, a really rather fine piece of work. But what's underneath it is for king and country, the idea of the king, the monarch, as the binding feature. Well, all of that, of course, was no good to Labour. They didn't want that. If you remember the patronising way in which Blair put his arms, effectively around the Queen in the Diana affair and effectively pushed her aside. So what you do devastatingly under Labour, you create this myth of a single British nation. But of course, there isn't a single set of values. So the only two values that being British have is diversity and tolerance, which is to say we're nothing. In other words, we've turned British nationhood simply into a flag of convenience. And why immigrants can be so proud to be British? They have no obligations. It's simply a meal ticket, if it's anything, to welfare, and this is monstrous. And so it also, of course, creates multiple layers of useless government that absolutely malfunction. It once again destroys any possibility of central government doing anything, as we saw with COVID, in which you had Scotland and England at war with each other over the regulations and so on. It's the whole thing is a disastrous, utter mess. And you know who summarised it best? The consequence. It was those rioters in the north of England. Their principal cry was, "We want our country back." They felt viscerally that it had been taken away. They felt viscerally that they had no voice. They felt viscerally that they'd been cheated. And you know what? They were right.
And so if we turn to the riots in particular now, I think one of the things that was very striking about that was, because Starmer was only 1 month into his premiership when they started to happen, but very quickly, partly because he's not a very skillful politician, I think it's fair to say, but the blame for the entire thing ended up sort of falling on his head, and he almost became a representative for 30 years of betrayal and the sense of having lost one's country. So, what did you make of his response to the riots? But in particular, it's going to be difficult for him, isn't it, in the fact that he's kind of just continuity Blairism, because all of the problems that have been created by our political system over the past 30 years, they're going to seem to lay at his door, aren't they?
That's exactly right. I mean, let's look at what he tried to do, of course, with the riots, was to claim that they were the product of this mythical far right. Remember, far right means absolutely nothing at all. It means just what you and I would call on the right spectrum of politics. So what he did, and I think it was a profoundly dangerous thing, he immediately politicized the riots. And it's very striking if you look back and compare the public reaction to the policing of the riots in 2011 and in 2024. In 2011, there was overwhelming support for police action. There was even significant, a majority supporting David Cameron, who'd only been Prime Minister a year again. It took place at the very beginning of his premiership. So there was remarkable unified response. What is very clear, if you look at public opinion, even in the very early days of the riots, before Starmer's full rigidity and all the rest of it had been revealed, was there were sharply different opinions. In other words, favourable, unfavourable polls swung in very different directions. So I think Starmer already showed then, first of all, his desire to politicise in a very crude and crass way. Again, the whole way in which he's trying to justify what were clearly Labour's taxation policies all along by blaming, 14 years of Tory misrule. Well, it's on the one hand, it's an obvious political tactic, but he is doing it with such crude repetitiveness and in such a tub-thumping way, and having, of course, mounted an election campaign, the so-called Ming-Va strategy, in which he threw away what could have been, if he or these alleged political geniuses like McFadden had more political nous, they would have realised they were going to win pretty well inevitably after the Conservative failure, a huge majority. They could actually have obtained a serious mandate if they had said, as they obviously intended to, we intend to do things. I think they would still have been elected, and they would have had a moral force behind them. As it is now, they're in the extraordinary position. They have 2/3 of the seats in the House of Commons, with 1/3 of those actually voting, supporting them, and 1/5 of the actual electorate voting for them, which leaves them in an extraordinarily fragile position. And you put your finger on something else. The Starmer himself is the quintessence of everything that I was talking about of the New Labour years. He is the lawyer. He is the man who believes that everything is controllable by legislation. He is the one who hates populism, who adored the European Union. In other words, if you think of Britain, if you think of why we're in the mess that we are now, that Blairite state that we talked about is the equivalent of Gulliver, if you remember Gulliver's Travels. It's the equivalent of Gulliver in Lilliput, the land of little people. And Gulliver is controlled by the Lilliputians by being tied down by lots and lots of ropes. Well, we're in exactly the same position. The reason that our politics don't work and our economy doesn't work is this vast mass of over-regulation and contradictory authorities that was created by the New Labour years. But of course, Starmer represents this. So when he says we want growth, it's just the equivalent of a magical incantation. In order to get growth, you would have to demolish most of this structure that we've been talking about. And of course, Starmer is temperamentally and intellectually, if he does indeed have a brain, completely incapable of doing that. But Laurie, we've been letting our own side off very badly. The real problem is that from 2010, or rather from 2005, when David Cameron was chosen as Conservative leader, you've had a Conservative Party which took Margaret Thatcher's notion in 1992 that it was that Blair was their heirs, literally, and they proclaimed themselves the heirs of Blair. There is a trio of figures who lie at the heart of the failure of conservatism. They were in power 14 years. They did nothing to repeal a single clause, let alone one of the acts that I was talking about now. And the key figures who are responsible for this terrible mess are Cameron, George Osborne, and above all, Michael Gove. It was Gove who was going round, handing round marked up copies of Blair's memoirs, as I understand it, to the cabinet and acclaiming him as the new Machiavelli. This is the catastrophe that we have had. This is why the Conservative Party has failed. But also, of course, it points out why this Labour government will fail. I mean, if I were advising the whoever is chosen as Conservative Party leader, the first thing they have got to do is to say, we will commit themselves, A, to reverse all the main planks of Blairism, but secondly, to show how the incoming catastrophe of this Labour government, because it's already manifestly catastrophic, to show how each point at which it fails goes back directly to all that legislation that we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation.
And so you mentioned Starmer, the lawyer there, and that's obviously his reputation. And so how is it that Mr. Rules has found himself so quickly bogged down in these never-ending sleaze scandals? And with that, and with everything we've been talking about, what's your prognosis for the current government?
I think a cackle of pleasure as one watches the disintegration of this awful man. I mean, can I say that my relations, I've never met Keir Starmer, I'm delighted to say, but we have, as they say, previous. At the time of my cancellation back in 2020, Starmer was the only person in public life who wanted poor little Darren Grimes and me to be charged under the Section 6 of the Public Order Act, which I think carries mandatory imprisonment and up to 6 years. But is the measure of the man, the measure of his nastiness, the measure of his desire for vengeance, the measure of his hatred of free speech and his general hatred of freedom. So Starmer and I have previous. How's he gone so badly wrong? Well, several people, I mean, if you think of Rosie Duffield's magnificent letter, she points out that this is a man who is now Prime Minister of the country who had no political experience. He is also not simply a lawyer. Everybody said to me, how on earth can this man be a QC? How can he be so, well, A, dumb, and B, how can he be so bad at public speaking? You know, from nasal whine. Well, I suppose he can't help that he comes from Reigate, but that's or indeed, my father was a toolmaker too, but I did something about it, I suppose. But what has gone wrong with Starmer is that A, he's not very clever. It's really important we recognise this. He gets 2 B's and a C when he is a scholarship boy at a selective school. That is very poor. Secondly, he practiced a very particular form of law, which is human rights law, in which you never plead before a jury. In fact, you never probably plead before a judge. Everything is done with written pleadings, which are merely these abstract theoretical statements. So he is a man who has lived the whole of his life in a formal structure of arbitrary rules. And he's got clearly no moral sense of right or wrong at all. And he simply says, if you remember when the whole business of the freebies from Lord Wahid Ali, who was wonderfully known, by the way, Laurie, at the beginning of when he first emerged under Tony Blair and was the youngest peer in the House of Lords, he was wonderfully called by Private Eye in the days when Private Eye was still funny and Ian Hislop has preserved a sense of political balance. He was known as Lord Wahid Boy, which I always think. Anyway, those first gifts from Lord Wahid Boy, what did Starmer say? I followed the rules. He couldn't register the hypocrisy. He couldn't register that following rules, you can follow rules minutely and still ignore, you're following the letter of the law, but you can completely ignore its spirit. He is a man who is incapable of distinguishing between those things. And of course, he's also, it seems to me, probably, what are the fashionable words, neurodiverse. He simply has no understanding of how an audience reacts to him. Do you remember that famous moment when he was speaking, was it on Question Time? I can't remember where, when he talked first about his father being, or some occasion when, for the 400th time, he talked about his father being a toolmaker, and the audience laughed.
When I grew up, my dad was a toolmaker. He worked in a factory. It's true. My mum was a nurse.
That thunderous look came over his face. He couldn't recognise, he thought they were laughing at his father. He couldn't recognise that they were laughing at him. Now, a politician who can't read the room like that is a very strange thing. So we've got somebody with absolutely no flair. Politics is obviously, you need to be highly intelligent. He's not. You need to have an awareness of how people operate, which he doesn't. We're not just rule-driven machines. But above all, you need an extraordinary sense of instinct. And there's a final point, I would suspect. Starmer is essentially a plodder. He's the kind of, you're nearest to your schoolboy days, he's the kind of awful person who was good at cross-country running. You know, that terrible plodding, maybe you were, that terrible plodding sort of thing. I'm afraid that really doesn't work. We're at a major crisis. You need those extraordinary skills which Thatcher or Churchill had. The person who can read the room has got that instinct to get the big picture, but at the same time can control the minute detail and manage people. And again, it's perfectly clear he has no skills whatever at this, and he's delegated them, as far as we can see, centrally to his chief of staff, to Sue Gray. And what's really important to understand about Sue Gray is a person of exactly the same type as Starmer. The job she did at the heart of Whitehall was to be head of this central, I call it the English Inquisition or the English Stasi. It's this bizarre thing at the heart of the Cabinet Office that's called, can you imagine, we actually have a department called Propriety and Ethics. And what it really amounts to is a machinery of censorship. It's a machinery by which you try to manage the entire processes of Parliament, the honour system, public life, by means of over-minute and rather absurd rules. You can't do it. Human beings aren't like that. I suppose if you wanted to use less, if I've called it the Inquisition or whatever, if you wanted to say or to put it in a broader context, it's the equivalent of the government HR department. And the catastrophe, of course, is that all of this new Labour world that I was talking about has infected business as well, precisely through, it should be just called personnel. It just needs to deal with hire and fire. And instead, it's imported into, especially all big firms, big international firms, the whole of this nonsense of rights and minorities and whatever that we've been talking about. So the infection has spread right outside our politics into the heart of our business, which again is why not simply the public sector is performing so badly, why so many businesses are performing so badly. So us on the right have got to acquire a new set of confidence. We've got a new sort of confidence. We've got to be aware that this constant talk of modernization and trying to change everything and calling the Conservative Party the nasty party and whatever has actually led to disaster. That the old system that we had, the system of parliamentary sovereignty, directly answerable to the people, was astonishingly flexible. It could, uniquely in Europe, it was capable of taking a system of representation through the gigantic changes of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of new classes, the acquisition and the loss of empire, the enfranchisement of women. It was strong enough, it was tensile enough to cope with all of that. Whereas this new structure that we created only 30 years ago, is already breaking up, is already clearly malfunctioning. So for once, I think, history, well, not for once, my view is history is the essential ground of human experience, not the abstract rules of even people as wonderfully intelligent as the founding fathers of America, or the much less clever people who tried to put together the European constitutions. That astonishing history of England and then Britain from the 13th century, from Magna Carta onwards, that is where the lessons are, from those individuals, from those patterns, from those institutions. And to recognize that the latest stuff they're just things of the moment that have got to be got rid of. We've to have a great repeal act and a great restoration. And any politician who can do that will go down as least a second Thatcher and possibly greater.
And so just to pick up on that obsession with rules, and we've seen this playing out a bit in the international sphere as well recently. So we had a bit of a warning sign a few weeks ago where the government suspended some of our arms licenses to Israel. And the reason that, Starmer gave for that in the Commons was that, he'd been following some guidelines and he'd applied a legal test and it said that we couldn't give them to Israel. And this didn't really seem to be a very strong way of defending such a decision. But perhaps more significantly now, they've given up our sovereignty over the Chagos Islands yesterday, in fact, when we were recording this. And why was that? Well, it wasn't really because of our national interest. It was because we might find ourselves on the wrong side of an international court or some interpretation of international law. And so it seems that, they're totally unable to justify things in terms of our national interest in this, obsession with rules, aren't they?
Totally. And it's, you left out what is arguably the most direct and obvious example, which is the British government has withdrawn objection to the arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court for Netanyahu. Again, on these spurious legalistic grounds, because once again, what we need to understand, Laurie, is that the coping stone of all of this isn't even the European Union. It is actually the entire structure that was set up in 1945 with the United Nations. And it is now clear anybody with a brain. Have you seen any serious activity by the United Nations to do anything about the situation in the Middle East? Does anybody think that the Secretary General of the United Nations could play any possible part in this? The answer is not. He's actually been ruled persona non grata in Israel. So what we've got to do, we've to recognize, and it's very, very difficult for generation after generation of politicians and people who are clearly as mechanistic and rigid as somebody like Starmer. The United Nations settlement, the international settlement of 1945, has turned out to be as destructive and as guaranteed to fail as the League of Nations settlement after the First World War. In other words, that again, the sort of language Starmer and that I find it difficult to control my language about David Lammy. The thought of David Lammy sitting at the same desk as occupied by Palmerston is a measure of our national decline. And this man is not simply ignorant, he is stupid. If you remember, famously on Mastermind, he was asked who succeeded Henry VIII, and he replied Henry VII. Now that's not ignorance, it's ignorance and stupidity. But the problem that we find ourselves in is that we have people like this confronting an entire system of international relations which has simply failed. The idea that we subscribe to this failure and that we try to invoke it. Again, Starmer and Lammy have been constantly going about, we need a resolution of the Security Council. We need a decision of the General Assembly of the United Nations, as though anybody would listen to it. As though, again, an organization where, for example, the Human Rights Committees of the United Nations, I think, until recently, or indeed it may even be so, was actually chaired by Saudi Arabia. Just inconceivable. But again, this mechanistic attitude of mind refuses to recognize that this has happened. The result is, the only proper bit, and again, you're clearly sensibly old-fashioned. I'm very, very much in favour. The only proper basis for the conduct of international relations is in accordance with national interest. How else is one to do it? Everybody else does it. We see it in every other example, in every other area. This, with the most stupid member of the government is obviously David Miliband. The idea that our being first to get to net zero is somehow like winning a kind of moral Olympics. Well, indeed, it will be winning a moral Olympics at the cost of everything that is left of British industry. The whole of our industry will be destroyed. We've already got electricity prices, I think, 4 times the cost of America. And heaven knows what the comparisons with China and India are. Again, all of this just shows the catastrophic nature of this mindset. And it's a mindset that covers the whole of this section of our political class, and which, of course, absorbed a very, very large part of the Conservative Party. And what was got to do is to separate out. It's almost you almost feel that you need some piece of chemical apparatus to separate out the good from the bad. It's fundamentally a task for you, for those of us on the right, for all those of us with sense and common sense, to argue, to debate, to point out, above all, as I was saying before, to try to recapture language, just that sense that words have meaning, that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, that the test of things is above all by their consequences, as what Jesus Christ said very accurately, by their fruits ye shall know them. That profound achievement of Anglo-Scottish thought, the Enlightenment, which was essentially rooted in inductive thinking based on evidence. And those of us on the right, can be confident. It really is true. The facts of life are conservative.